So is it ethical to move to Spain in 2026? And if you are moving to Spain anytime soon, how do you do it ethically? How do you do it responsibly? I'm seeing this question come up here in the audience. I'm seeing it come up in my Move to Spain Masterclass. And I get it. You're wondering, if I move to Spain and I'm seeing all these headlines around over-tourism, locals protesting, the housing crisis here, and you're wondering, well, if I move to Spain, am I just going to be part of the problem? And so as someone who helps people to move to Spain, I've thought a lot about this. And so while I don't purport to have the perfect answer to these questions, and I certainly don't purport to be any sort of moral arbiter on how somebody should lead their life, but having thought about this question, I wanted to share with you my thoughts and maybe give you some ideas of how to think about this if it is on your mind. And if you don't know me, I'm James. I've lived in Spain for a number of years, and my very job is to educate people on how to move to Spain. And I say how to move to Spain the right way. And often the right way is how to get the right visa for you, do the paperwork right, save money, time, stress. But it also encompasses this broader question of how do you move to a place and set up a rich and a good life? And so I think this question does come into it, although there might not be any sort of black and white answers. And as someone who lives here, I'm very aware of the housing pressure and the different issues in this country. But before we talk about the ethical side, I think it's worth touching just briefly on the topic of immigration. Currently, there obviously are a number of pathways to move to Spain. There's visas, there's residencies, digital nomad visa, non-lucrative visa, routes for Europeans and their family. And I think while the legal side doesn't answer the ethical question, I think it's worth pointing out that currently Spain's immigration policy is very pro-immigration. Spain wants people to move here. Why is that? It wants people to move here because we have an aging population, like in many countries, particularly Western countries. And an aging population means that more stress on the healthcare system. It means more pensions that need to be paid. Obviously, we have a social safety net here, which includes public healthcare, includes a pension system. And so currently, Spain wants to bring a lot of people in who can pay into the tax base, right, to support that aging population. But then if we move on to the ethical question, can you move to Spain ethically? How do you move to Spain ethically? I really think there's sort of two parts here. One is, are you moving to Spain legally through one of these, legal pathways that have been provided, a visa, a residency? Are you doing that properly, abiding by the rules and upholding kind of your promise under that visa in terms of, if you're here on the non-lucrative visa, you won't work. You're playing by the rules, right? In terms of how you come here. Now, I do want to make one thing clear. I am drawing a distinction here, or at least I'm talking about people who have the financial resources, who have the privilege to be able to make a choice to move to Spain through one of these routes. I'm not talking about people who are fleeing countries because of war, because of persecution, because of extreme hardship. I'm not holding them to that standard. I'm talking about, as I say, people who have the privilege to make the choice to move to Spain through a legal pathway. I think with that privilege comes the responsibility of doing it right. So first topic, are you moving here properly according to a legal framework and abiding by those rules and not trying to skirt around them and everything else? And I think that's potentially a pretty obvious one. But it's the second one that I really want to dig into. And that is, when you have moved to Spain, are you building a life here that integrates into Spanish culture, that contributes to Spanish culture and doesn't sort of consume Spain, doesn't sort of float above Spain and just consume it as almost like a place to land? And I think this is probably the more interesting one and the one that is more relevant to the question about, how you move to a country and set up a life there ethically. And on this topic, I wanted to first touch on housing, because housing is a huge issue right now in Spain. We have a housing crisis like in a lot of countries. I see people in the audience concerned that, in moving to Spain, they're worried about what their impact is going to be on what is a limited housing stock supply. Obviously, if you move to Spain, you need a home to live in. And I see this question crop up in three different ways. Somebody in the last cohort of the Move to Spain Masterclass said to me, well, when I move to Spain, I'm going to want to get a long-term rental. But first, I need a place to stay for a few weeks while I find my long-term rental. And, I'm worried about using Airbnb for those 2 weeks. I thought about this, and really my take on this was, look, you could get a hotel for those first few weeks. You could get an apartment hotel for those first few weeks. But I think it was also important for this person to kind of zoom out when looking at their move. If you're moving to Spain to set up a life here, to pay taxes, to integrate, to contribute, I'm not sure it really matters whether you're going to use an Airbnb for the first couple of weeks, right? I think wringing your hands around that sort of topic, I don't think it's that relevant. Now, obviously, do whatever you think, and there's non-Airbnb options. I'm just not sure if that's a big one to kind of worry about. There's bigger fish to fry in terms of, how you sort of set up a good life here. The second way I see it come up is with people moving to really popular destinations. So people say who are moving to Valencia, right? Really popular city for people to move to, a city that does have a lot of housing pressure. And so I see people concerned of like, well, I'm moving there and I'm going to be taking away a home in a city that's already lacking homes. And I don't have an easy answer on this one. I can't tell you how to feel about this or, what's kind of right or wrong. What's important is that you are at least aware of the challenges in the city you're moving to. I don't think necessarily it should mean you move somewhere else or anything like that, but I think having some awareness of what's going on in the city that you're moving to and being aware of the housing shortage, I think is a first step and a really important one. And a little tip I would give on this, I'm seeing more and more people show interest in moving to less traditionally popular regions, places like Zaragoza or Logroño or Valladolid. And I think part of this is people really want to sometimes be forced to immerse themselves into Spanish culture, not be tempted by a big English-speaking community. But I think part of it is the housing question, and they know that it's going to be easier for them to find housing. So if you're wondering about this question about sort of cities with more or less housing pressure, I just want to open your mind to the possibility that maybe one of these smaller cities is actually a good option for you. And I'm seeing people choose that option. So the third way I see the housing question come up, and I don't see this that often actually in this audience, but I get questions about, how do I invest in property in Spain? And again, this is an area where I'm just sharing my thoughts. I am not a moral arbiter here. The way I'd think about it is, well, what are you planning to do with that home, that property you're going to buy? If you're going to live in it, well, you need a home, right? And that's good. You're living in a home. You're buying a home to live in it. If you're going to rent it out long-term, well, you're actually adding long-term rentals to the housing ecosystem, to the housing stock for people who live here to rent. And I'm sure you will be a good landlord. The third one is if you're planning to come here to purchase a property as investment and rent it out on booking.com or Airbnb, short-term vacational rental, I think just be aware that this is the very thing that people are complaining about, right? This is the very thing that people are frustrated about here when you see those protests. So I think, be aware of that aspect. I never give any information about in my masterclass or in my courses about how to sort of invest in property in Spain. And that's a decision that I have made around, it's just not a market, for want of a better word, that I choose to serve. As I say, you do you, but that's how I would think about that choice around buying a home here. Now let's turn to that other element I mentioned, which is about contribution and integration and not treating Spain as something you sort of consume. Look, there's a lot of different ways to live in Spain. But I think if you're moving to a country as an immigrant, then to the extent that you have the privilege of resources and time, I think it's a good thing to attempt to integrate into that country, to learn the language, to grow within the community, to make connections and build a network within the local community and not sort of just float above it, because it's warm and there's the med and things like that. So how do you move to Spain in a way that you attempt to integrate and contribute? I'm going to give you some ideas. It's not an exhaustive list. I'd love to hear your ideas in the comments down below. I think one thing that comes to mind is paying your taxes. This is a country where you'll often see people concerned about taxes here. And I think that's fair enough. You have to figure out your tax burden before you move to Spain, because you have to figure out if you can afford to live in Spain or you're willing to pay those taxes. But I think, once you're kind of all signed up and you're here, it is important to play fair with your taxes, because those are the taxes that support the community that you're joining. And this is different from doing your move in a tax-efficient way. That's obviously perfectly fine. Like you decide to move to Andalusia instead of Catalonia because there's less wealth tax. Well, go ahead. That's a great idea. I think another way to think about this is paying attention. And this is an area where I can do better. Paying attention for me is like reading the local news. It's very easy to translate news articles. You can just right-click on your browser now and it will give you a great translation of El País or whatever newspaper you want to read. Understanding what's happening in the country and following along. As I say, I'm the first one to put my hand up and say, I can get very head down. I sit down on the sofa at night and often the newspaper I open is New York Times or something like that. I want to open more El País. I have a subscription and see what is happening in the country. And I think that is important because I think then we can fully be a part of the country. We understand the issues here. And when we understand the issues, we can have an opinion on them. And so when we see housing protests, instead of being here concerned that, we're taking away a home, I think we go to the housing protests as well. Yes, as people who have moved here. And again, this is 100% an area where I need to be better. I didn't go to the last big housing protest in Madrid, and I regretted not doing that. I think it is really important to have a voice here. Protest is something that is a huge part of Spanish culture. And so that is a way of paying attention and contributing. Volunteering is another one. If you're coming on a non-lucrative visa, people often ask me, can I volunteer? You can, as long as you're not being paid any money or you're not being paid even in kind. No, you can't be paid in jamon, that's still payment, but you can volunteer. You know, there's local organizations. There's a website called Haces Falta. I'll link it down below where you can search for volunteering opportunities. And I think that's a great one as well. So the paying attention thing is really important because it enables us to integrate and build a really rounded life here. Another one I would say here, the last one, is chipping away at growing into the community and learning Spanish. I think these are important, as I say, for not sort of floating above the culture or the society. Community is challenging, and I've talked about this. I've sent emails about this recently. It doesn't mean on day one you're hanging out with all these Spanish speakers. It takes time. There's layers that you have to build. But I think chipping away at growing into the Spain is all about community. You see the old men sitting playing dominoes, in the bar. And I'm not challenging you to on day one be playing dominoes with them. That's going to be a high level of Spanish to understand. But it does mean building your life in a way that is very sort of Spanish, right? That has a strong network of community of all levels, of other English speakers, of Spanish speakers or bilingual people, of the people who, the vendors at your market, whatever it may be, your local baker. I think understanding that is a part of the Spanish culture that we love. And so I think as hard as it is, chipping away at that and growing into the culture and contributing by being a part of it, by being a part of that beautiful Spanish network of people that we see all around when we walk through the cities and that we want to be a part of, and you can be a part of it. And I think that's a part of making a good move and building a good life here as well. And so I think the big question here isn't around whether you rent an Airbnb for a couple of weeks. I think it's bigger questions about how you think about the life you want to build in Spain, how you're going to become a net contributor to the culture here. And there's a lot of ways to contribute. You will contribute financially, and you can contribute by becoming a part of the culture and the community. And that's the beautiful thing about immigration, right? It's that people come with their experience, their ideas, their story, and add them to the culture that is already here to make a greater whole. And I think that's the opportunity when it comes to moving to Spain. But I think also what we're talking about, although we're talking about this ethical question around moving to Spain, I think all these things that I've mentioned are not just how to answer that ethical question. I actually think they're ways of building a better life in Spain. I think for your move to Spain, I think these are all ways and opportunities to build a richer life in Spain. The whole idea for so many people of moving to Spain is that you come here, we come here, I came here, and you see the culture, you see the wonderful sense of community, you see what this country has built and what the people of this country have built, and we want to be a part of it. By addressing these aspects of your move, you will build a richer life in Spain, a life that is more profound for you and has more joy in it and is kind of really deep down the move that you want to make and the life that you want to build. It takes some work, particularly on the community side. It takes work to pay attention, to read the newspaper again. Hands up, I'm not doing it enough. But when we do it, when we make that effort, I think, we deal with these ethical questions, but we also just build a better life here. And that's the whole point. That's the whole point of why we want to come to Spain deep down for so many people that I meet. It's about building a richer life. I'd love to know your thoughts. Let me know in the comments down below.